Her obsessed ex stalked and cornered her at work, unaware the crime boss was watching every floor. Dozens of monitors cast pale light across Damon Reyes's face at 9:43 p.m. A man in a dark coat walked through the Ashford Grand's front doors below, and Damon's attention sharpened instantly. Not paranoia, recognition. The specific predatory patience in the way this stranger surveyed the lobby. Methodical, unhurried, exactly the way 15 years of survival had taught Damon to identify a threat before it fully revealed itself. He didn't know the man's name yet. He knew exactly what kind of danger he was watching walk into his building. And 4 floors below, Camille Hart had no idea her worst nightmare had just found her again. Subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments, because what happens next on that executive floor is going to leave you speechless. Like, share, notifications on. You are not ready for this. 11 months earlier, during Camille's first week at the Ashford Grand, Damon noticed her. Not through romantic interest, through the specific professional recognition of someone whose competence mirrored his own. The careful, practiced vigilance of a person who moved through the hotel's floors like she'd learned, somewhere, that safety required constant attention rather than assumption. He watched every camera feed personally. All of them, every floor, every shift. 18 months earlier, a coordinated attempt on his life had come from inside his own staff. A security failure so devastating it had permanently changed how he ran his entire operation. He'd learned, the specific hard way that violence always taught its lessons, never again to delegate the trust of watching his own building to anyone else completely. Marcus Delgado, his head of security, understood that mandate professionally. What he'd started noticing over recent months, though he'd never voiced it directly, was his boss's unusual, sustained attention to one specific employee's feed, Camille Hart. Section 4. Executive Floor. A pattern Marcus recognized without yet understanding the story behind it. Damon had noticed the pattern, too, in himself, without fully acknowledging what it meant. The way Camille flinched at certain phone calls during her shifts, her shoulders tensing in a specific, learned way that had nothing to do with normal workplace stress. The way she positioned herself near exits whenever an unfamiliar man lingered too long in her section. Small details accumulating over 11 months into a picture Damon understood completely, without ever needing her to explain a single word of it. Someone in her past had left marks that never fully faded. He'd started quietly researching enough to understand that much, never intending to intervene unless the threat became direct and immediate. Tonight, it became exactly that. Nathan Cole crossed the Ashford Grand's lobby floor with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who had finally, after 14 months of increasingly obsessive tracking, located exactly what he'd come for. Charming, in the specific practiced way of someone who had spent his entire adult life learning which version of himself got him what he wanted. He'd spent those 14 months tracking Camille through increasingly sophisticated means, a private investigator he couldn't legally afford, information extracted from her old friends through manipulation dressed as concern, the patient obsession of a man who viewed her survival independent of him as a personal insult rather than simply the end of a relationship. He had no idea the hotel where he'd finally located her belonged to a man whose resources and reach dwarfed anything his own increasingly desperate methods could produce. Nathan's path cut directly toward the executive floor's service corridor, timed with a patience that made Damon's blood go cold the moment he recognized exactly what kind of threat he was watching unfold in real time on his monitors. This wasn't a random guest wandering the wrong floor. This was surveillance, planning, the specific predatory patience of someone who had studied Camille's schedule closely enough to know exactly when she'd be alone. Marcus glanced up from his own station, catching the sudden shift in his boss's posture. "Boss." Damon didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, watching Nathan disappear into the service corridor exactly as Camille's shift wound down for the evening. "Get eyes on Section 4, now." Camille was gathering her things near the service corridor when she heard the voice. The specific voice her entire body remembered before her mind fully processed it. Warm, practiced, carrying the exact tone Nathan had always used right before things went wrong. Camille. She turned, and every instinct honed by 2 years of escalating obsession screamed at her simultaneously. Nathan stood 10 feet away, hands in his coat pockets, an easy smile on his face like he'd simply run into an old friend rather than violated a restraining order to track her down at her workplace. "You look good." His voice carried none of the urgency the moment demanded. Casual, warm, the specific manufactured normalcy of a man who had convinced himself, across 14 months, that her fear of him was simply confusion that better explanation would eventually fix. "I've been worried about you. You need to leave." Camille's voice came out steadier than she felt. Years of practice keeping panic contained behind professional composure, even as her pulse hammered. "There's a restraining order, Nathan. You know that. I'm calling security." Nathan's smile didn't waver. "Restraining orders are just paperwork, Camille. Paperwork doesn't stop people who actually love each other from working things out. You know that's not what this is really about." He took a step closer, closing distance in the narrow corridor, with the specific, unhurried confidence of a man who had planned this exact confrontation across 14 months of watching, waiting, tracking her location through every increasingly desperate method available to him. "We need to talk. Properly. Not like this. I have nothing to say to you." She took a step back, her shoulders hitting the wall behind her, the specific cold realization settling in that the corridor offered no clear path around him. "Please, just go." His expression shifted. Small at first, the warmth in his eyes cooling into something harder, the specific chilling transformation Camille had watched happen 100 times across 2 years, charm curdling instantly into menace the moment he didn't get the response he wanted. "I'm not leaving until you actually listen this time." His voice dropped, losing its performative warmth entirely. "You owe me a real conversation after everything we built together." In the security suite 4 floors above, Damon watched the exchange with the specific controlled fury of a man, translating rage into precise, immediate action rather than blind panic. Marcus was already moving before Damon finished speaking, security personnel converging on the executive floor, with the coordinated efficiency of a team trained for exactly this kind of rapid response. Though none of them fully understood yet why their boss cared this intensely about one specific employee's safety. Below, Nathan's hand shot out, closing around Camille's wrist. The pressure was immediate, bruising, the specific grip that confirmed every fear Damon had quietly carried for months about exactly what this man was capable of the moment he stopped performing charm and started demanding control. "Let go of me." Camille's voice finally broke through her paralysis, sharp and desperate. "We are done, Nathan. Nothing you say is going to change that." His grip tightened instead of releasing. "You don't get to just decide that. Not after everything." The elevator at the end of the corridor dinged. Nathan's head snapped toward the sound, his grip on Camille's wrist faltering for exactly 1 second as the doors slid open. Damon Reyes stepped out. His expression carried none of the calculated calm Nathan had walked in expecting to encounter in a hotel corridor. Something colder, more absolute, the specific quality of controlled violence that had built an empire and ended more threats than Nathan Cole could possibly imagine standing in front of right now. The instant recognition crossed Nathan's face immediately. Whoever this man was, wherever he'd come from, Nathan understood with sudden catastrophic clarity that he had badly, irreversibly miscalculated exactly whose territory he had just walked into tonight. Damon crossed the distance between the elevator and the service corridor without hurry, each step carrying the specific, unhurried, absolute authority of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to communicate danger. "Remove your hand from her." Flat, quiet. The same devastating calm he'd used to end negotiations far more dangerous than this one. Nathan's bravado attempted to reassert itself, his grip on Camille's wrist not fully releasing yet. "Who the hell are you? This is a private matter. Between me and my girlfriend." The word landed like an accusation Nathan genuinely believed carried weight. Damon's expression didn't shift. "Ex-girlfriend. 14 months ago. There's a restraining order with your name on it, filed 6 months after she left you. Currently sitting in a system you've violated at least twice before tonight." Nathan's confidence flickered. "You don't know anything about Nathan Cole, 32. Currently 3 months behind on the private investigator you can't legally afford, the one who tracked Camille's employment records here through a data broker, operating well outside any legal framework. You've contacted at least 4 of her former friends over the past year, extracting information through manipulation you framed as concern for her well-being. You located this building specifically 2 weeks ago and have been surveilling her shift schedule since." Damon's voice never rose, never wavered, each detail delivered with the specific precision of a man reciting facts rather than making accusations. The horror crossing Nathan's face was immediate and complete. "How do you—" "I know exactly who you are because I've spent the last several weeks understanding precisely what threat you represented before you ever set foot in my building tonight." Camille stood frozen against the wall, her wrist still caught in Nathan's loosening grip, staring at Damon with an expression that mixed devastating relief with something closer to shock. She had barely exchanged more than a polite nod with this man in 11 months of working his hotel. He knew details about Nathan's stalking campaign more precise and more comprehensive than she herself had fully documented. Nathan's grip finally released completely, his hand dropping to his side as the weight of Damon's certainty settled over him. "I don't know who you think you are, but I own this building." Damon's voice carried the specific flat finality of a man stating an obvious fact rather than asserting dominance. "Every floor, every camera, every employee, including the one whose wrist you just bruised in a corridor you had no legal right to enter." Nathan's eyes darted toward the corridor's exit, calculation crossing his features as he assessed his diminishing options. He didn't make it 2 steps. Marcus Delgado and 2 additional security personnel had already positioned themselves at both ends of the corridor, the specific coordinated precision of men executing a planned response rather than reacting to sudden chaos. Nathan's attempt to flee collapsed the moment he registered exactly how thoroughly he'd been contained. "You have 2 options tonight." Damon's voice stayed level. "Absolute. You come with my men quietly for an extended conversation about exactly what happens if you ever come near her again. Or you make this difficult, and I promise you'll regret that choice considerably more than the first option." "This isn't legal. You can't just—" "I'm not calling the police, Nathan. Police have already proven themselves insufficient at actually stopping you, given the 2 restraining order violations already on record before tonight. I intend to succeed permanently where the legal system has repeatedly failed." The specific cold clarity in Damon's voice made Nathan's remaining bravado collapse entirely. Marcus stepped forward, flanked by his men, closing the remaining distance with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd handled considerably more dangerous situations than one desperate stalker cornered in a hotel corridor. Nathan didn't resist as they led him away. Camille remained pressed against the wall, her breathing still uneven, watching the man who had terrorized her for 14 months disappear down the corridor flanked by security personnel who moved with the specific, quiet competence of people who did this kind of thing regularly. The overwhelming relief flooding through her chest collided immediately with a fresh, disorienting fear, because the man standing in front of her now, the one who'd just recited details about her stalker's campaign, with more precision than she'd managed to document herself across 14 exhausting months, had clearly been watching her far more closely than she'd ever imagined. Damon turned to face her fully once Nathan was gone. The controlled violence in his expression from moments earlier had shed away completely, replaced by something quieter, almost uncertain, an expression Camille hadn't yet seen from him in 11 months of brief, polite professional exchanges. "Are you hurt?" His voice carried none of the flat authority from the confrontation, softer now, careful in a way that made her chest tighten with something she couldn't immediately name. Camille rubbed her bruised wrist, staring at him with the specific, overwhelmed exhaustion of someone processing too much in too short a span of time. "How did you know all of that?" "About Nathan, about the restraining order, about the—" her voice caught, "about the private investigator. I didn't even know he'd hired someone." Damon was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his expression that looked, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely uncertain. "I need to tell you something." His voice dropped lower, carrying a weight that made Camille's already racing heart pick up further. "And I need you to hear all of it before you decide whether you can ever trust me after tonight." She waited, wrist still throbbing, adrenaline still coursing through her system, watching this powerful, controlled man visibly steady himself before continuing. "I've watched every shift you've worked for the past 11 months. The confession landed in the quiet corridor, with its own specific weight, entirely different from anything Nathan had said to her all night, and Camille found herself unable to immediately identify whether the sensation building in her chest was fear, or something else entirely. The corridor felt smaller, with the confession hanging between them. "Every shift," Camille repeated it slowly, testing the weight of the words, her mind racing through 11 months of ordinary workdays, coffee orders, small talk with Priya at the front desk, moments she'd never once imagined were being observed by the man who owned the building. 11 months of my life. You watched all of it." Damon didn't flinch from the accusation in her voice. 18 months ago, someone inside my own staff tried to have me killed. Since then, I don't delegate the trust of watching my own building to anyone else. Every floor, every camera, every shift, it started as operational necessity." He paused, something raw crossing his expression that Camille had never once seen from him in their brief professional exchanges. "It didn't stay that way with you. Explain that." Her voice carried none of the softness the moment might have called for, sharp instead, demanding the full truth after 14 months of Nathan's lies dressed up as devotion had taught her exactly how dangerous half-explanations could be. "I noticed you were good at your job, careful, vigilant in a way most people don't need to be. That's what caught my attention first." Damon's voice stayed steady, but something underneath it carried genuine discomfort at being examined this closely for the first time. "Then I started noticing things that had nothing to do with your work. The way you flinched at certain phone calls, the way you positioned yourself near exits whenever an unfamiliar man lingered too long in your section. I didn't know the specifics. I understood enough to know someone in your past had left marks that never fully faded. You researched me. Enough to understand there was a threat. Never enough to intervene unless it became direct." His eyes held hers, unflinching despite the vulnerability in his voice. "I told myself for months that watching wasn't the same as interfering, that I could make sure you were safe without ever needing you to know why. Tonight proved that line wasn't as clean as I wanted to believe it was." Camille's hands curled at her sides, fury and something far more complicated warring underneath her ribs. "Do you understand what that sounds like? A man watching me for 11 months without my knowledge. That's exactly the kind of thing Nathan—" "I know." Damon's interruption came quiet, immediate, carrying none of the defensiveness she might have expected. "I know exactly what that sounds like, and I've spent the last several minutes bracing myself for you to say it. But there's a difference between what he did and what I did, even if the surface looks similar. He watched you to control you. Every piece of information he gathered was a tool to bring you back under his influence. I watched you because I made a decision months ago that your safety mattered to me, and I never once acted on that decision until tonight forced my hand. That's not a good enough explanation. I know that too." His voice carried genuine acceptance rather than argument. "I'm not asking you to forgive it tonight. I'm asking you to understand it, because you deserve the truth more than you deserve my comfort right now." Camille studied him for a long moment, adrenaline still coursing through her system, the specific disorienting collision of relief and violation, refusing to settle into anything simple. What happens to Nathan now? Damon's expression hardened slightly, the controlled authority from the confrontation returning. I intend to ensure he never comes near you again, through means considerably more permanent and effective than anything the legal system has managed across 14 months of ignored restraining order violations. That sounds like you're planning something illegal. I'm planning something effective. He held her gaze steadily. But I also understand you deserve a say in exactly how this resolves. If you want this handled entirely through legitimate legal channels, I'll make sure the evidence exists to finally hold him accountable properly. If you want considerably more permanent measures taken, I can arrange that too. This is your decision, not mine. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the hotel 40 minutes later, summoned by hotel security's official report of the incident, her expression carrying the specific weary frustration of someone who had processed Camille's original restraining order 6 months earlier and watched the system fail to enforce it twice since. I've been trying to get real charges filed against this man for months. Sarah's voice held genuine anger as she reviewed the incident report Marcus had prepared. Every violation gets logged, and nothing sticks because we've never had documentation solid enough to actually prosecute beyond a slap on the wrist. Damon's response came immediate, decisive. I have 11 months of surveillance footage documenting patterns of behavior around this building alone, cross-referenced timeline data on his tracking methods, and financial records tracing the private investigator he hired illegally. That should be more than sufficient. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly at the specificity of what he was offering. That's considerably more comprehensive than anything we've had access to before. I intend for it to be enough this time. Over the following days, the evidence Damon's surveillance had quietly assembled became the backbone of charges finally substantial enough to hold. Documentation stretching back over a year, patterns of stalking behavior corroborated across multiple sources, evidence of the illegal private investigation that gave Sarah's office exactly the legal foundation they'd never previously possessed. Nathan's arrest happened through official channels, processed with airtight evidence that left no room for the kind of dismissal he'd learned to expect from a system that had failed Camille twice before. What happened during his private conversation with Damon's people beforehand, Camille never asked about directly. She understood, without needing details, that whatever assurance Damon had extracted ran considerably deeper than legal consequences alone, and for the first time in 14 months, something in her chest settled into genuine certainty that Nathan would never again be a threat she had to calculate around. Priya found her in the break room 3 days later, relief evident on her face as she finally learned the full scope of what had happened. I knew something was wrong for months. You'd get that look whenever your phone buzzed at certain times. I just didn't know how bad it actually was. Camille studied her coffee cup, still processing everything that had unfolded. Neither did I, really, not until it was standing in front of me in a hallway. Priya's expression softened, something knowing in her gentle observation. And the other thing, Damon, how are you feeling about all that? Camille was quiet for a long moment. I don't know yet. He watched me for 11 months without asking. That should feel exactly like what Nathan did, but it doesn't. No. Camille's voice carried genuine confusion at her own reaction. It doesn't feel the same at all, and I don't fully understand why yet. Priya's smile carried the specific, gentle wisdom of someone who had watched the entire situation unfold from just close enough to understand things Camille herself was still working through. Maybe the body understands something before the mind catches up. Fear feels different from safety, even when both start with someone watching you. Nathan's sentencing came 6 weeks later. The comprehensive evidence Damon's surveillance had assembled, patterns stretching back over a year, corroborated tracking data, the illegal private investigation documented in full, gave the court exactly the foundation Sarah Chen had spent months insisting the system needed. Not the reduced version, the full account. Stalking, violation of a protective order, multiple counts, illegal surveillance conducted through an unlicensed investigator whose own business practices unraveled once federal attention turned toward the paper trail Nathan's obsession had created. 5 years. A permanent restraining order with actual enforcement mechanisms attached this time, the kind Sarah promised would follow him regardless of which city he tried disappearing into afterward. Camille sat through the sentencing without trembling once. 14 months of learning to manage fear around this specific man's presence had built something in her that finally, in that courtroom, converted into something closer to relief than anxiety. She never asked Damon what conversation had happened privately before the arrest, processed through official channels. She understood, without needing details, that whatever assurance existed ran deeper than the legal consequences alone, and she chose, deliberately, to let that particular truth remain unexamined. Some things were better left exactly where they belonged. The weeks following Nathan's sentencing brought a specific, careful recalibration between Camille and Damon, neither of them rushing past the complicated foundation their relationship had been built on, both of them navigating unfamiliar territory with more patience than either had initially expected from themselves. Damon started asking, rather than simply observing, small things at first, whether she'd prefer her shift schedule adjusted, whether she wanted additional security measures around her apartment, questions delivered with none of the unilateral decision-making that had characterized his intervention that first devastating night. Camille noticed the shift immediately. "You're asking now?" She observed it one evening, 3 weeks after the sentencing, finding him in his security suite reviewing routine reports, rather than the intense surveillance session she'd half expected to interrupt. "I learned that lesson the hard way." Damon's voice carried genuine acknowledgement rather than defensiveness. Watching someone because you've decided their safety matters isn't the same as asking what they actually want. I spent 11 months confusing those two things. She settled into the chair beside his desk, studying the wall of monitors casting their familiar pale light across the room. "And now? Now I'm trying to learn the difference, slowly, without assuming I already understand what that looks like." Camille felt something in her chest loosen slightly. The specific, complicated tension she'd carried since that first confession finally beginning to ease into something more comfortable. "I'm still not entirely comfortable with 11 months of surveillance I never consented to. I know. I'm not asking you to be comfortable with it. I'm asking whether there's room to build something honest going forward, even with that complicated history sitting underneath it." She considered the question seriously, the way she'd learned to consider everything since Nathan had taught her exactly how dangerous it was to accept easy reassurances without examining them fully. "Maybe. If it's actually different this time." "It is." His voice carried quiet certainty. "Because this time, I'm not deciding anything for you. I'm simply here, if you want me to be." Priya's earlier observations stayed with Camille through those following weeks. The specific truth that fear and safety could both start with someone watching you. But the body always seemed to know the difference long before the mind fully caught up. She'd spent 14 months flinching from Nathan's attention, every glance and every tracked location feeling like another thread tightening around her autonomy. Damon's attention had never once produced that same visceral recoil, even in the disorienting hour after learning the full scope of his surveillance. Whatever complicated feelings she carried about the method, the underlying truth remained unshaken. He had watched her for 11 months and never once made her feel owned. That distinction, she was slowly learning, mattered more than she'd initially wanted to admit. Months passed with the specific, unhurried pace of two people, building something real, rather than performing a relationship for anyone else's benefit. Damon learned to ask before acting. Camille learned to trust attention that came without any expectation of ownership attached to it. Testing that trust carefully, deliberately, never rushing past legitimate hesitation just because the alternative felt easier. It was an ordinary evening, nearly 4 months after that terrifying night in the service corridor, when Camille found herself walking into the security suite without any particular reason beyond simply wanting to see him. The monitors cast their familiar pale light across the room, dozens of feeds showing the hotel's quiet nighttime rhythm, empty hallways, the lobby's late shift, the specific unremarkable ordinariness of a building operating exactly as it should. Damon looked up from his desk, something warming in his expression at her unannounced arrival. Long shift, quiet one. She crossed the room and settled into the chair beside him, the same chair she'd occupied that first uncertain conversation months earlier, except now the weight in her chest carried none of the disorientation from those early weeks. She looked at the monitors together with him, watching the hotel's rhythm unfold in real time, not the unsettling surveillance she'd once imagined it to be, but simply the quiet, shared vigilance of two people who understood exactly what it cost to build genuine safety. I used to think these screens were something to be afraid of. Her voice stayed quiet, thoughtful. And now? Now I think they're just how you learned to care about things, even before you knew how to say it directly. Damon reached over, his hand finding hers with none of the urgency or ownership Nathan's touch had always carried, simply present, simply asking without words whether she wanted the contact. She held his hand without hesitation. Outside the windows, the city continued its ordinary nighttime rhythm, indifferent to the fact that 4 months earlier, in a narrow service corridor 4 floors below, where they now sat together, the worst night of Camille's recent life had become the beginning of something she'd never once expected to find. Not rescue, partnership, built slowly, deliberately, on the specific foundation of two people who understood exactly what real safety required, after each of them had learned, in very different ways, precisely how dangerous the alternative could be. The monitors kept their quiet watch together, no longer one person observing alone in the dark, but two people choosing, deliberately, to watch over what mattered to both of them side by side. If this story kept you holding your breath from that first camera feed to this quiet ending, if it reminded you that real safety looks nothing like control, and everything like someone finally choosing to ask instead of assume, subscribe right now because we are not finished. Share this with someone who needs it today. Like this video, drop your city below, and turn on notifications, because the next story